So I tried to show that there is some continuity in that regard, but there's also continuity in the fact that many migrants, especially from the Eastern Cape, still try to, still aren't that invested in the urban areas. They still see their main commitment as lying in the rural Eastern Cape, I think. I mean, it is a generalization, but I think from my own research, the sense I get is that they don't want to commit too much to the urban areas for all sorts of reasons, for reasons that have to do with morals and values and whatever else, but also for practical reasons. The fact of the matter is that it's a lot more expensive to live in Rustenburg than, say, the Eastern Cape. But yeah, I mean, I also agree with you that you make an interesting point about very high wages, well, relatively high wages, and how wages have increased exponentially since, say, the 1970s. But then my argument is that in the rural areas, costs have increased hugely now, and the rural areas are changing in quite fundamental ways, and there are all sorts of new pressures in the rural parts of Pondoland. For reasons I won't go into because I sort of covered that in my paper. But I do agree with you that I think you implied that this isn't really, that we shouldn't be speaking of a migrant labor system, and maybe this isn't a crisis of migrancy, it's a crisis of many more things: wages and structural unemployment and rural production and that sort of thing, rural poverty. So, yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Unfortunately, we have to end it here. We could have gone on for another hour at least, I'm sure. It's a fascinating panel, different dimensions to these issues. I think you're coming back at 1:30, am I right?
Let's make it 10 minutes. Let's make it 20 past. 20 past.
20 past. Put it back at 20 past. Instruction needs to come back at 20 past. The next chairperson will be also a fascist.
I think we should get started with the next panel, or we'll run into time problems again. I'm not a fascist, I'm a feminist, so I'm going to try and manage this in a slightly gentler way, but perhaps more efficiently. I'm Shireen Hassan, I'm from the politics department here at WITS and a SWOP board member. So our panel is on regulating reproduction, and I'm going to go straight to the panelists. We have Andries Bezuidenhout presenting on behalf of himself and Sakela Bushlungu. We have Joseph Major from SWOP itself, presenting on informal settlements, and Andrea Shaw presenting a comparative study of South Africa and Australia. So let me go with Andries.
Thank you very much, Shireen. First of all, I'd like to apologize on behalf of Sakela. He really wanted to be here, but he had to go to Cape Town to kind of prepare the ground for his new job there. The paper, I really liked Peter Alexander's point he made at the end of the previous session about revisiting WOP and the cheap labor power thesis. And in a way, what we're trying to do in this paper is, it has a bit of a more theoretical focus, is trying to understand what are the forms of control emerging on the mining landscape post-apartheid. So what we do in this paper is look at three places: Rustenburg, Welkom, and then we also look at the Northern Cape, specifically the Kuruman, Katu, Postmasburg area, in trying to understand what the emerging social order is on the post-apartheid mining landscape. And we make the argument that we're moving essentially from a system that was based on migrant labor and the compound system to what we call enclave society, drawing on the work of Guy Mahoney, but expanding his economic notion of an enclave towards a more enclaves as something that is social, that explains social and market formations as well. In a way, our intervention also speaks to the discussion on whether we have a strong or a weak state yesterday, and I think that isn't very helpful to talk about the state as a strong or a weak state. The point is, a state is a very complex thing and it's highly uneven. So what we're trying to do in a way is to inject a bit of a geographic notion of place and landscape and how landscapes are designed to control. So that's essentially what this paper is about. So if we just a few sort of points about where we come from. There's a paper we wrote before the massacre called From Compounded to Fragmented Labor. So in a way we're building on that work, understanding the move of workers out of the compounds, also forms of control that the NUM had. With its control over compounds, losing that control, and what kind of landscape emerges after this, and how unions also adapt to try and change their strategies of organizing. So it's part of a larger project on Rustenburg, Welkom, Carletonville, Katoen, Masiro, Eastern Cape. But in this paper, we only focus on these on the three places. What we argue in that paper is that if you look at the cheap labor power system and how it's designed as a form of control, there's a spatial element to it. It's also about reproductive control, what you eat, but also where and with who you have sex, associational control, who you associate with, worker self-organization, but a part of that is also political control. And we argued in the paper that these forms of control add up essentially to what we call a normative corporal order, because how you arrange bodies in time and space is a really important part. Is a really important part of this. So what I'll basically do is to go through dynamics in these three towns in order to explain what we mean with enclave society. And we start with Rustenburg, and there you've got on the hill, you've got the McMansions, security villages emerging as an important place. It means just a boom town, Rustenburg. At the bottom there you see company apartments, often rented out typically to your NUM shop steward. This is Philibone, the second school built by the Royal Bafokeng Authority. It's cost $500 million. It's a posh, very top private school. The king went to Hilton, didn't feel at home, and reconstructed an African Hilton in Rustenburg. The children who go to this school will not come to Wits University or UCT, they'll go to Princeton and Harvard. That's the aim. He got teachers from all the top schools in the country to teach there, the top private school. 70% of the places are reserved for Bafokeng. If you show merit, but you can't afford it, the king pays for you. The rest of the 30% is on a fee-paying basis. So it's a very interesting. That's just the admin block. These are the staircases in the residences for the children. Stone Cherry designed their uniforms. The kids get iPads. This is top-notch private school. These are new suburbs emerging in Rustenburg. Typically, your NUM shop stewards would be able to afford homes here, RDP houses. We still have compounds, but it's often in these compounds you find the contract workers. It's very important. The compound as a formation is not gone, but it's become a place where contract workers are housed. There you can see how the contractor thing is still part of the system. Compounds are called residences. They turn into single rooms for men to live in. But this is very interesting. In the compounds, in the past, where the mines used the compounds as a form to keep workers on the inside, workers now use compounds as a way to keep criminals out. So the gating issue isn't only for the McMansions on the hill in the private security estate. Workers, the upper end of the working class, also actively use forms of physical control on the landscape, fences and gates, as a way to insulate themselves from crime and disorder. These are the informal settlements emerging around the mine shafts. That's another one. That's the police station burnt down during the Impala strike. And this is just how the informal settlements fuse into villages. So the point is, what you essentially have here is a logic of gating. In these informal settlements, there's very little presence of the state. There's no policing, there aren't schools, there's no electricity, there's no water. People buy water from private providers who drive around with trucks. And law and order is essentially maintained by vigilantism. So for violence to spill over into the broader labor relations system should actually be no surprise. So the point is, the state hasn't been able to establish a presence in many parts, and in other parts, spaces are privatized either on company property, compounds, or these private residential spaces. And these are the kinds of enclaves you see in Rustenburg. And with enclaves as a sub-national formation emerging as a way of controlling disorder, What you also see is the emergence of sub-national identities. Contestation, who is Bafokeng or Mofokeng, who's not? Who can live in a compound, who can't live in a compound? Permanent worker, contract worker, men, women. There's as Crispin pointed out, there's an area called Sondela, or short for Sondelani Makosa, you know. So again, identities playing out in how people occupy land and live in those areas. So the enclave is essentially a sub-national formation, spatial formation, with inclusion and exclusion based on these sub-national identities. That's just numbers. 38 informal settlements in Rustenburg. That's the housing backlog. 24% of people in Rustenburg live in informal settlements. That's compared to the 15% national average. In Rustenburg, there are 60,000 more men than women, and this shows that the migrant labor system is, to some extent, still with us. Only 30,000 of those live in hostels. It means 30,000 other men do not live in hostels and they live elsewhere in these informal settlements. That's just statistics on permanent and contract workers. We saw some of that yesterday. A third of workers in platinum mining are employed through subcontractors, and they typically paid lower wages. That's just the logic of the enclave in Rustenburg. That's how mining communities maintain order in the absence of a state that actively nationalizes a welfare floor, policing and the services a state typically is supposed to provide. Welkom. That's number one shaft revisited, Dunbar Moody with my colleague Sakela there. That is the compound or the hostel where Dunbar did his work in 1975. That's what it looks like now, or in 2011. Just a little bit about Welkom. It was designed it was a very important part of gold mining in South Africa, but it's in decline now. It's all those traffic circles you see in Welkom, but this is a parking lot in an old mine. So you see a lot of abandoned mines, and what has happened is the emergence essentially of illegal mining. In Welkom, the major issue is illegal mining. That is geostal, and that is where gold is processed in Welkom. There you see some of the signs put up on illegal mining, abandoned shafts. These are some of the security guards who nearly killed us. When we went on a trip there, Dunbar's we've had a few close shaves with law and order in the form of private security firms who often are in cahoots with these illegal miners. That's some illegal mining even going on the surface. There's a lot of mining waste on the surface, so it's not only underground, it's also on the surface. Those are some illegal mining openly going on in Welkom, illegal mining activities going on. I don't have time to go into detail, but essentially these illegal miners link into global organized crime. We're told by some of the managers that the gold is exported through Lanseria to the Paris jewelry industry. So these are the kinds of linkages we're talking about. They're local linkages, but they're also going international. And the question I'd like to ask you, what kind of state are we talking about? A state that cannot maintain basic law and order in a mining area. I mean, in one incident with an underground fire in Welkom, more than 30 illegal miners died. Illegal miners sleep underground. They're serviced by sex trafficking networks. Often human trafficking is going on with child workers coming from other countries, basically forced to work underground by these gangs. It's a major issue. It's not a national debate. My question is why? The Northern Cape, but again, just the point is it's enclave society. There's also sub-national identities playing into this, and I think along with these enclaves of order and disorder, you see these, again, the sub-national identities becoming ways for people to organize. Let me go on to the Northern Cape. That's the Sishen mine. It's an open cast mine. 2 weeks after the deal at Lonmin, the workers at Sishen also went on strike. They weren't rock roll operators, so I think there are interesting things, interesting comparisons here, and I think if we want to understand Rustenburg, we also have to do it comparatively. You can't understand Rustenburg by looking at Rustenburg only. You have to look at the broader mining landscape. There's blasting in, and these are the new houses built by the mining companies in Katoe, Postmasburg, really fascinating places. The mining companies are putting a hell of an effort into providing new accommodation. The scale of the problem isn't the size of, in Rustenburg. It's a much better situation than Rustenburg. That's the company hostel, but you also see the emergence of informal settlements. I like the irony in this. Welcome to promised land, not promised land. It's because the land was promised by the local government, but it's never been transferred to the people. So it's called promised land because the land was promised, but the land will never be transferred to the community. So major struggles around land, and again identity. Who can control land? So you've got these posh houses for the upper end of the labour market, but at the half of the workers at Sishen Mine are engaged through contractors. The permanent workers have an employee share ownership scheme. Last year they got payouts of 350,000 rand each after tax. Okay, some of these workers earn more than I do on an annual basis. Okay, that's not it. That tells you what Pretoria University pays. That's colleagues, you're complaining with your, no reason to complain. But it is an interesting question why those who are paid best go on strike and not us at the bottom, you know. It's,
because we have a union.
Thanks, Professor Webster. So, okay, so what are we talking about? What are the social formations emerging to control this landscape? And this is where we'd like to, this whole notion of the enclave society. First of all, the spatial control. It's about gating, privatized gated areas, but also some continued legacies of migrant labor. What is very interesting is often there's a new form of migrancy emerging, and that is managers migrating to the areas where the mines are. The mines are closer to communities now, and you see these managers migrating. Anglo has these private jets that fly from here to from OR Tambo to Kutu and Postmasburg. In terms of reproductive control, there's the growing number of women in the mining industry and mining towns is interesting, but also then the issue of harassment to family scenario. Associational control, there's union competition, but often these sub-national identities emerge in the competition between unions. I should mention in the Northern Cape, a major issue at Sishen Mine is the employment of workers from Namakwa land, called by the Tswana-speaking workers Manamakwa. Namakwa landers, they're seen as not local workers, and it's seen as a DA plot to take over the province from the ANC, the employment of these Afrikaans-speaking workers from Namakwa land. So in all these cases, these sub-national identities play out as part of the enclave logic. Just political control, there's issues around ownership, PEE. I can't really go into all of this in detail, but all of this does add up, we would argue, to a new normative corporal order, maybe disorder, but it's based on this lines of inclusion and exclusion. I think I should maybe end there. My time's up, and let me allow my colleagues some time as well. Thank you very much. I apologize for having to rush through all of this. It is a more theoretical paper, and we're kind of trying to bite off a big chunk here by taking on Walpy, who has been taken
Hey,
on.
don't take on Walpy.
Updating Walpy.
Thank you, Andries, for that sort of rapid romp through post-colonial modernity. I think that people will be able to pick up on some of the detail through the questions, so it's not the end of the discussion at all. Thank you, Joseph.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Joseph. I'm from SWOP and University of Zimbabwe. The title of my presentation is From Matereleng to Ikemeleng, Informal Settlements, Community Protests and Insurgent Citizenship in Rustenburg. This paper is based on fieldwork that I did in Matereleng Informal Settlement in Rustenburg in 2012 and early 2013. So this paper uses the case of Matereleng to explore the impact of platinum mining on informal settlements, or on those people who are living on the margins of the multi-million rand platinum mining business. They are living on the margins, both literally and metaphorically. The name Matereleng is derived from Materele, or a reference to Mzilikazi and these Materele people who passed through Rustenburg sometime in the late 19th century. But the name is derogatory, and it is used to refer to a community of immigrants. So the people who live in this community, they do not like this name. And recently they changed the name from Matereleng to Ikemeleng. And this transformation is related to the transformation of the community from a squatter camp into a more formal settlement. So the community is dominated by immigrants from countries such as Zimbabwe, Malawi, Zambia, Mozambique, etc. And one important thing is that Matereleng is surrounded by almost, I think, 5 mines, platinum and chrome mines. That is Aquarius, Extrata, Anglo, Samango, etc. And the community feel that these platinum mines are doing very little to provide them with jobs and also basic social services. So this is the basis of my research. I wanted to understand how this community is engaging with the mines and also the municipal authorities in Rustenburg. So the research analyzed the centrality of community protests in residents' struggles against mines and municipality for service delivery. And it argues that the reality of being marginalized and living on the shadow of a multi-million rand platinum mining industry has seen such communities resorting to community protests and other insurgent practices to force the mines into providing them with jobs and basic social amenities. Just a bit of background on Matereleng. Matereleng started off as a squatter camp for farm workers who were working on farms around Kunda. But gradually, especially in the 90s, with the advent of democracy and the introduction of living out allowances, mine workers were working at several mines, started living in this informal settlement. So it gradually grew to become one of the biggest informal settlements in Rustenburg. So there are mine workers who are living there, there are job seekers who are living there, there are also traders who are living there. But one important issue is that most of the people who stay in this community are immigrants from elsewhere. They don't have a claim to autochthony in this area. That is the reason why the informal settlement is often referred to as Matereleng, the area where there are a lot of immigrants. Just a bit of theoretical approach. I try to deploy Houston's concept of insurgent citizenship in understanding what is happening in this community and why this community is always engaged in community protests against both the municipality, but especially against the surrounding mines. Nielsen, 2007, argues that what Houston and Friedman suggest by their notion of insurgent citizenship is that the city is not a neutral container, but a political space in which the meaning of citizenship is daily contested. Within the concept of political contestation is also implied the challenge of power relations. This also tallies with this whole idea of the presence and absence of the state in such areas. You would find that there's very limited state presence in these informal settlements. So in most cases, in terms of policing, you find that the state outsources policing to CPFs and other groups. So as a result, we also find that these CPFs at times end up abusing their powers, etc. So I argue that insurgent citizenship is therefore shaped by political contestation, community protests, and the destabilization of the entrenched. I also argue that community protests also expose the dark side of insurgent citizenship. That is, when communities engage in these protests, there are also abuses that happen. There's violence, there's exclusion of outsiders, there's also corruption. So because of that, it is important to take note of the fact that Houston's concept or theory of insurgent citizenship cannot adequately explain what is happening in these informal settlements. We also need to adopt or to deploy other theories such as Andries and Houston's theory of violent democracy or the plurality of violence. That is, with the coming of democracy, we also find the democratization of violence, that is the plurality of violence, in terms of, which is expressed in terms of protests, be they mine strikes, be they community protests, vigilantism, etc. Let me briefly talk about marginality and insurgent citizenship. The people who are living in informal settlements, and especially the people who live in this particular informal settlement, they argue that they are marginalized by the mines. They argue that most of the mining activities affect their community. Mining activities are leading to environmental degradation, pollution, etc. But they are not benefiting much from the mines in terms of jobs, in terms of social services, etc. Until very recently, there was no running water in the community, no proper roads, etc. And people yet to self-provision. Like at some point, people were buying water for 5 rand for a 20-liter container of water. So because of all those problems, the community has almost always resorted to community protests. They would block the roads and then engage in protests, which oftentimes tend to violent protests. And talking to them, they argue that it's working, and because it works, then more often than not, once in a while they engage in one protest or another. But who is local here? Because I've already highlighted the fact that this is a community composed of people from all over the place. There are people from Eastern Cape, there are people from Zimbabwe, and the locals, that is people from Northwest, are the minority in this community. That is the reason why it is people from the Northwest who refer to this area as Matereleng, a community of of immigrants. So in this case, a local in this context is just somebody who is a bona fide resident of this community, somebody who is able to produce a proof of residence, somebody who is known by the local council. Let me quickly rush through some issues. The people in this community also believe that to them, because they live on the margins, because they are a forgotten people, because the state do not really care about them, nothing to them comes for free. So because nothing comes for free, they engage in constant community protests. If I can quote one of the community leaders,